Margaret Campbell was one of the most scandalous women of the century. Born into immense wealth, she captivated the world with her beauty, charm, and rebellious spirit. Crowned Debutante of the Year, she became more famous than any actress, her name immortalized in songs celebrating her allure. Yet beneath the glamour, her life was haunted by tragedy. Forced to cast aside her first love over religion, she then lost her true love in a tragic plane crash just before their wedding, sneaking into his funeral to hide her heartbreak from the world. Suffering 8 miscarriages and guilty of countless affairs with many in high society, always chasing a love that remained just out of reach. When she finally achieved her dream of becoming a duchess, it came at a devastating cost. A marriage poisoned by betrayal and cruelty. Dragged before the courts, Margaret's dignity was shattered as the world gawked at the infamous Polaroids, stolen by her husband, exposing her in intimate moments with a faceless lover. Branded sexually perverse by a scornful judge and abandoned by a society that once adored her, Margaret's world fell apart. Her fortune gone, her reputation in tatters, she was left to wither in the loneliness of a hotel suite. Even her own daughter turned away, leaving Margaret to charge visitors £10 for the chance to dine with her as her mind dimmed and her life faded. This is the tragic and scandalous story of the Duchess of Argyll, a woman who soared to the heights of high society only to be cast aside, broken, and forgotten. If you like stories like this, please consider subscribing, just giving a comment, or supporting the channel on Patreon. And now, let's get into the scandalous life of Margaret, the Duchess of Argyll. Ethel Margaret Wigham was born on December 1, 1912, in Scotland to George Hay Wigham and Helen Mann Hannay. Her father, a self-made millionaire, embodied the relentless pursuit of ambition, while her mother, a woman of striking beauty yet mercurial temperament, viewed her daughter with an air of disappointment, finding her too plain for her tastes. Yet, where Helen saw flaws, George saw a precious gem, showering Margaret with affection and indulging her every desire. At just 6 weeks old, Margaret embarked on a journey across the Atlantic with her mother to join her father in New York, where he had established himself in a duplex on the prestigious Fifth Avenue. New York, with its cacophony of urban life, became the backdrop of her formative years, the imposing Woolworth building etching itself into her earliest memories. The relentless blare of ship horns from the Hudson and East Rivers became a nightly soundtrack, a sound that she later claimed haunted her dreams with thoughts of mortality. From the very beginning, Margaret displayed an unwavering sense of independence. She outright rejected her birth name, Ethel, a name she despised. When her mother called her Ethel, she would remain silent, as if the name itself were a stranger. Only when the name Margaret was spoken would she respond, a small act of rebellion that hinted at the steely resolve that would define her life. She shunned the company of other children, preferring the solitude of her own orderly world. They were messy, and I simply did not like them touching my toys, she would later recall. Dolls held no allure for her. It was her beloved teddy bears that captured her affection. She kissed them so often that their fur wore thin, a testament to the fierce attachment she felt for them. At age 7, during a transatlantic voyage, she insisted her teddy bears accompany her. When her father refused, she threw a tantrum on the gangplank, declaring, "If they do not go, then neither do I." As usual, her father capitulated, revealing the sway she held over him. Margaret's adoration for her father stood in stark contrast to the fraught relationship she shared with her mother. Helen, who chose to raise Margaret without the assistance of a nanny until she was 7, was a figure of constant emotional volatility. Margaret could never quite please her, and the tension between them simmered just beneath the surface. Margaret was naturally left-handed, something which at the time was viewed as a handicap and a sign of an immoral character. As such, her left hand was tied to her side, and she was forced to write with her right hand. After this, she developed a lifelong stammer. This stammer, much to her mother's chagrin, persisted despite numerous failed attempts to cure it. Helen, in turn, attributed the stammer to what she saw as her daughter's lack of intelligence. In addition, she found her young daughter completely lacking a sense of humor. Helen's emotional distance and harsh judgments left Margaret feeling perpetually inadequate, fearing displacement in her father's affections. A fear Helen cruelly stoked by threatening to have another child when Margaret would disobey. George's infidelities and Margaret's growing independence further made Helen feel isolated. The domestic strife was no secret. Arguments between George and Helen were frequent, yet divorce was never on the table. Accusations flew like arrows. Margaret labeled her mother as selfish, while George deemed her difficult. The irony of Margaret's inability to understand her mother would only be fully realized later in life, as she, too, became engulfed in scandal and tumultuous marriages. One of Margaret's few companions during her childhood was Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, whose life was already marked by tragedy. Barbara's mother, it was whispered, had met a tragic end. Margaret's life took another turn across the Atlantic as her family moved to England. England, however, did not bring her the comfort she sought. She found little joy in her new school. She did not enjoy studying, nor did she enjoy the interactions with girls her own age. Her father, ever indulgent, catered to her every whim. When she wished for companionship, he gifted her 3 puppies, sparking a lifelong love for animals. Throughout her life, Margaret was known for her kindness to animals, an affection so deep that a friend once mused, "I often wonder if she ever loved anyone but her father and her dogs." Margaret's childhood ended abruptly when she left her beloved bears outside one night in the rain. They were completely destroyed as she held them crying. Helen decided it was time for the birds and the bees talk, telling Margaret, "It's this awful thing we have to put up with. You just have to bear it and get on with it." By 14, Margaret began sneaking off with boys and was very popular with the opposite sex. At 15, she met David Niven, then a 17-year-old public school boy, during the school holidays. During school holiday, she lost her virginity to him and would often go to London to visit him. Eventually, she became pregnant, infuriating her father. There was no question of her keeping it. The scandal was confined to the household, and it was decided she would undergo a secret termination at a London clinic. After her recovery, she was sent away to a finishing school in Paris. At her Paris finishing school, Margaret faced yet another set of restrictions: no makeup, no nail polish, rules she resisted with every ounce of her stubborn will. To her, these were more than mere cosmetics. They were the armor that protected her carefully crafted image. Every day, she would come to school in makeup, and every day the teachers would force her to wash it off. The other girls, unimpressed by her defiance and beauty, quickly labeled her as fast. Her stammer, which had long been a source of insecurity, was dismissed as an affectation, further isolating her. The summer before her 18th birthday in 1930 marked a pivotal moment in her life. Margaret was to be presented at court, a debutante stepping into society's glittering spotlight, where wealth and status were her tickets to the world. On the 1st of May, her coming-out party was nothing short of a spectacle, an event drenched in opulence that cost a staggering £40,000 and drew 400 guests. With an unlimited dress allowance, she and her mother, Helen, selected the finest gowns, ensuring that Margaret would be the belle of every ball. The society columns were enraptured, hailing her as one of the most beautiful debutantes of the season. Invitations flooded in, and Margaret became the coveted guest at every event, capturing the attention of young men while earning the envy of her peers, who whispered behind her back, dubbing her that Margaret Wigham. On the 27th of May, Margaret was formally presented to Queen Mary at Buckingham Palace. Among the distinguished guests were Thelma Furness and the Prince of Wales. But it was the young Ali Khan who truly captured Margaret's attention. Dressed in a striking white tunic and turban, he was a vision amidst the sea of formality. "I looked at him and he looked at me," Margaret would later recall, a moment that sparked a passionate love affair. The very next evening, at Edwina Mountbatten's ball, Margaret and Ali Khan were formally introduced. From that night on, they were inseparable, dancing at every ball and spending sun-drenched days together at Ascot. Ali, not yet the worldly playboy he would become, was deeply in love with Margaret and fiercely protective of her. His devotion was so intense that he approached her father, George, to ask for her hand in marriage. But George was incensed. The idea of his daughter converting to Ali's faith and the social stigma attached to Ali's mixed race was too much for him to bear. Cloaking his disapproval and concern for Margaret's youth, George forbade the union and ordered that she never see Ali again. Despite her father's command, Margaret and Ali continued their love affair in secret, exchanging letters and meeting whenever they could. Their romance thrived on stolen moments, but when her parents discovered their clandestine meetings, they swiftly intervened. The relationship was forcibly ended, leaving both heartbroken. Ali, in his despair, threatened to take his own life if he could not be with her. Meanwhile, Margaret, now a media sensation, was hailed as the most beautiful debutante of the season. Reflecting on that time, she remarked, "I was my own little star in a social world, a glowing figure who had tasted both the intoxicating highs of first love and the crushing lows of loss, all in the same dazzling season." Margaret's name quickly became a staple in the society columns, appearing with such frequency that rumors swirled, whispers that her father had hired a press agent to ensure her prominence. Though never confirmed, these rumors only added to her mystique. She had effortlessly become an it girl, a debutante who embraced the limelight with the poise of a seasoned star. Every outing, every twirl on the dance floor was captured by photographers, and Margaret ushered in a new era, the celebrity debutante, becoming as recognizable as any film star in England. Margaret's social calendar was overflowing, and with it came the constant company of different men, sometimes two in the same evening. Her presence was not just expected, but anticipated at every fashionable haunt, and night after night she was seen out, dazzling the crowds with her beauty and charm. Yet, while Margaret thrived in the glittering spotlight, Ali Khan, her once devoted companion, could not so easily let go. Night after night, he sat alone at the Embassy Club, requesting the band to play "I've Got a Crush on You," the song that had once belonged to him and Margaret. Even as the world around her trembled under the weight of economic turmoil, Margaret's life appeared untouched by hardship. 1930 was packed with gaiety and fun, and nobody can take that away from me. Nobody, 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 she would later recall, fiercely clinging to the memories of those carefree days. Just a month after her 18th birthday, Margaret found herself falling in love once more, this time with George Kitson, a man 17 years her senior and married. George, or Glenn as he was known, was a wealthy adventurer with a taste for the thrill of race car driving, big game hunting, and a string of affairs. Margaret quickly became one of his many conquests. Despite his marital status, both George and Helen approved of Glenn, welcoming him into the Wigham family as if his marriage were a mere formality. Glenn became a fixture in Margaret's life, sending her flowers and records after their nights together, his presence both thrilling and comforting. His exploits in aviation, which earned him the nickname "the man who cannot be killed," due to his numerous brushes with death, made him a hero in the public eye, his face frequently gracing the front pages of newspapers. In one of his final letters to Margaret, while he was off on a record-breaking flight, Glenn spoke of ending his marriage and finally making her his wife. They arranged to meet at the aerodrome, their future seemingly within reach. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. On the afternoon of the 5th of May, as Margaret finished a photo shoot, a newspaper headline caught her eye, shattering her world. Glenn Kitson killed in air crash. The shock nearly overwhelmed her, but she managed to buy a newspaper, desperate for details. The tragic story confirmed her worst fears. Glenn and Captain Gladstone had perished when their plane crashed into a mountain, the engine crushing Glenn upon impact. Forced to grieve in silence, Margaret bore the weight of their secret relationship alone. Glenn's wife, having discovered one of his letters detailing the affair, banned Margaret from the funeral. But Margaret, ever resourceful, found a way to attend. She slipped in unnoticed, sitting quietly at the back, her heart heavy with the loss of the man she had loved. "Had I married him, my life would have been happy, never dull, and protected," she later reflected, mourning the future that was forever lost. But Margaret, as always, was able to move on quickly, and the summer season was upon her, and she was once again swept into a whirlwind of balls, parties, and trips across the continent with her parents. She filled her nights with new boyfriends and social engagements, focusing intently on the present and trying to push the past into the shadows. It was at a wedding that Margaret crossed paths with Charlie Sweeney, the man she would later marry. Charlie was an American millionaire and former football star who served as an usher while she was a bridesmaid. Charlie spoke of how he felt she was stuck up at first, and he found her rather dull, but they mingled in the same social circles, and bit by bit, I fell under her charm, he later admitted. Their subsequent dates led to an informal engagement, though for Margaret, proposals held little meaning. She simply liked the romance of them. Yet for Charlie, the idea of the promise was a commitment, and he firmly believed in their future marriage. In December, as the year drew to a close, Margaret and her parents journeyed to Egypt. Before leaving London, she had become unofficially engaged to yet another man, Max Aitken, the eldest son of Lord Beaverbrook. Max, much like Glenn, was a sportsman and a pilot, and despite his father's wealth and influence, he harbored little interest in politics or journalism, much to his father's disappointment. Yet, despite Max's admiration for Margaret, Lord Beaverbrook was less enthusiastic. He warned his son that marrying Margaret would be a foolish mistake, believing Margaret was simply title hunting. In the warmth of Egypt's endless nights, Margaret Wigham continued to be the center of fascination, her charm drawing admirers like moths to a flame. On Christmas Eve, she encountered Charles Greville, the Earl of Warwick, a dashing pilot whose heart she swiftly captured. Enchanted by her, Charles pursued Margaret to Aswan, and their love affair blossomed amid the beauty of the desert. They cruised along the Nile, rode through the golden sands, and filled their days with each other's company. It wasn't long before Charles proposed, and Margaret, in a moment of impulsivity, again accepted. I thought, well, Max is a long way away, and it's likely they won't meet, she rationalized. Her diary revealed the internal tug-of-war she faced. Initially, she planned to end her engagement with Max, yet a letter from him caused her to reverse her decision, ending things with Charles. But then, as was her nature, she wavered once more, deciding to marry Charles after all. Her thoughts briefly drifted to Charlie Sweeney, to whom she also penned a brief farewell letter. To Margaret, the allure of being a countess was intoxicating, but Charles's mother opposed the match, calling her son immature and marriage to Margaret a mistake. George Wigham, too, was unimpressed, finding Charles lacking in ambition and financial means. Nonetheless, Margaret was resolute. She would marry him. On March 4th, Margaret sailed home with her new fiancé, and the newspapers eagerly welcomed the story of the debutante and the Earl. The public was captivated by the union of a millionaire's daughter and an impoverished peer, with George worrying about the financial strain of maintaining Warwick Castle. Meanwhile, Lady Warwick pleaded with Helen, "If you love your daughter, don't let her marry my son. He is a liar, he has no manners, and he picks his nose." Charles's behavior only confirmed the warnings Margaret had received. His manners were appalling. He failed to greet George and didn't even bother to stand when Helen entered the room. George, sensing disaster, insisted that Margaret break off the engagement. "He is so rude now. What's he going to be like when you marry him?" he cautioned. Reflecting on her true feelings, Margaret admitted that she did not love Charles. In a twist of fate, Charles himself was in love with another woman, Rose Bingham, and perhaps his rudeness was a deliberate attempt to push Margaret away. Whether intentional or not, it worked. Margaret returned his ring and ended the engagement. In her later years, Margaret would express regret over this decision, lamenting the love she had discarded too hastily. "It was sad, really, because I think I did love him," she confessed, laying some of the blame at her father's feet for his ill advice. Yet, as one chapter closed, another swiftly reopened. Margaret soon found herself back in the arms of Charlie Sweeney, admitting that it was he, not Charles, whom she truly loved. Her fifth engagement finally culminated in a wedding on the 21st of February. As she prepared to leave her home as Margaret Wigham for the last time, her father took her aside and offered words that would resonate throughout her life. "Just remember, if you are ever in trouble or need me, I will be there," he told her, a promise that would prove true in the years to come. Their wedding day caused a sensation. bringing traffic to a standstill for 3 hours as the public and press swarmed to catch a glimpse of the bride. No film star had ever received such a reception, the papers marveled. The couple embarked on a 6-week honeymoon cruise through the West Indies, a journey that should have been filled with marital bliss. Yet the honeymoon was not as idyllic as Margaret had envisioned. Charlie's jealousy and possessiveness quickly surfaced, casting a dark shadow over their time together. Margaret felt suffocated by his reactions whenever she mentioned past suitors, his insecurities clouding their days. Charlie, however, remembered the honeymoon differently, recalling it as a wonderful time spent with the most beautiful girl in the world. Soon after her marriage, Margaret fell pregnant. One day, while walking in the park, the celebratory gunfire honoring the Queen's birthday startled her dogs, sending them bolting in all directions. She spent hours frantically chasing them, and though they were eventually returned, the strain took its toll on her. Ignoring her symptoms, Margaret pressed on, determined to maintain her social commitments. But a few days later, while at the theater, she realized something was terribly wrong. She was beginning to miscarry. Charlie, ever discreet, covered her with his coat, and they quietly left without causing a scene. A few months later, Margaret found herself pregnant again. As her pregnancy progressed, complications arose. In her 8th month, a simple cold spiraled into something far more dangerous. Initially dismissed as indigestion, her symptoms worsened until she struggled to breathe. A specialist was called, and Margaret was diagnosed with double pneumonia and a severe kidney infection. Her temperature soared to 104 degrees, and for 5 agonizing days, she teetered on the edge of life and death, her condition reported daily in the newspapers. In a desperate attempt to save her, doctors induced labor, but tragically, her baby girl was stillborn. A funeral was held, and the child was buried according to Catholic rites. When Margaret finally awoke from her coma, she was unaware of what had transpired. Anxiously, she asked about her baby. A nurse, fearing for Margaret's fragile state, even suggested giving her another woman's child, as it was uncertain whether Margaret would survive. A priest was called to administer last rites, and holy water from Lourdes was sprinkled over her. Miraculously, 3 hours later, her condition improved and her temperature began to fall. Within 2 days, Margaret was out of danger, and she credited the holy water with saving her life. When Margaret was finally told that her baby had died, Charlie was conspicuously absent. He was off celebrating her recovery at the Embassy Club. This was a betrayal Margaret would never forgive. Within a year, she became pregnant once more, but fate dealt her another cruel blow, and she suffered another miscarriage. Over time, Margaret would endure a total of 8 miscarriages. "I felt a complete failure as a woman," she later reflected, the weight of loss pressing heavily upon her. The strain on their marriage grew as their differences became more pronounced. Charlie envisioned Margaret as the perfect society hostess, entertaining his business partners and golf friends. But Margaret longed for the carefree days they once shared, frequenting local cafes and theaters. "I began to feel like a bird in a not-so-gilded cage," she admitted, bitterness creeping into her voice. "I made him. I put him on the map. He was a commoner before me." Their social circle included prominent figures like Thelma Furness, the Prince of Wales, and another former mistress of his, Freda Dudley Ward. When Thelma left London for America, Charlie often accompanied Wallis Simpson to her secret meetings with Edward. Margaret, however, grew increasingly disillusioned with Edward, seeing him as a desperate and unhappy man. She gradually distanced herself from that set, and after Edward's abdication and his controversial visit to Germany, she and Charlie severed ties with him altogether. Determined to have a child, Margaret underwent various operations and took medications to reduce the risks. Finally, on June 19, 1937, Frances Helen Sweeney was born, her arrival causing a media sensation. The press buzzed with excitement, captivated by the birth of Margaret's long-awaited child. However, by the time war clouds gathered over Europe, Margaret and Charlie's marriage was already unraveling. They had grown apart, each wanting different things, and neither willing to compromise. Her lavish upbringing made her view their life together as insufficient, almost impoverished in comparison to her expectations. An ill omen came when Margaret accidentally threw away her engagement ring along with some wrappers. I would rather have lost anything else. It was never off my finger, she lamented to a reporter, the symbolic loss echoing the growing distance between them. Yet, they kept up appearances, vacationing in New York. In America, they mingled with the social elite, rubbing shoulders with the Winston Guests and William Paleys. During a visit to Monte Carlo with Douglas Fairbanks and his new wife, Sylvia, Margaret discovered she was pregnant once again. However, the atmosphere darkened as Germany annexed Austria, and the world watched with growing unease as Mussolini aligned himself with Nazi Germany. Political discussions filled the air, overshadowing the glittering parties and carefree days. Back in London, they were listening to the radio when Neville Chamberlain's declaration of war reverberated through their suite at the Dorchester. For Margaret, the war announcement was a frustrating disruption. She detested the idea of retreating to the countryside, longing instead for a return to New York. By March 1940, she found herself back in London, now cloaked in an eerie stillness. She and Charlie took refuge at the Dorchester Hotel, one of the safest places in the city, and it was there, in April, that she gave birth to their son, Brian Charles Sweeney. As bombs rained down on London, the couple slept in the Dorchester's sauna room, deep underground, alongside Diana and Duff Cooper. Eventually, Charlie's concerns for Margaret's safety grew, and he demanded she leave for Wales, where she would be safe with the children. But after depositing them there, she returned to London, utterly bored by the countryside. Determined to find purpose, Margaret volunteered at the Beaver Club, working as a waitress. However, the exhausting hours took their toll, and she eventually gave it up. Her next attempt at contributing led her to the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund, but she found the work dull and uninspiring. When America joined the war, Margaret joined the Red Cross. She proudly became the second woman in England to wear an American Red Cross uniform, which she found very gay and exciting, even posing for society photographers in her new attire. Margaret was soon appointed entertainments officer, responsible for booking dance bands and cabarets for the troops. Her charm attracted stars like Bob Hope, Jack Benny, and Bing Crosby, and she even arranged for Vera Lynn to perform several concerts. Yet, her growing social interactions with the men sparked Charlie's jealousy. He began to suspect her friendships were more than platonic. Tensions reached a breaking point as accusations flew on both sides. Margaret was convinced Charlie was seeing other women and making a fool of her. Finally, her parents, George and Helen, intervened. After confirming Charlie's infidelities, Margaret felt a sense of relief. He was certainly no paragon of virtue, and I did not have to put up with those nerve-wracking scenes anymore, she concluded. The final unraveling of Margaret and Charlie's marriage came swiftly. One weekend, Charlie claimed he had to dine with an American general, but instead he met with Sylvia Ashley, the glamorous showgirl and widow of Douglas Fairbanks, who was already remarried. For Margaret, this was the final straw. She decided that their marriage was over. Despite Charlie's attempts at reconciliation, Margaret had grown indifferent to him. Margaret maintained that she had been a model wife and accused Charlie of committing adultery first, while Charlie insisted that her insatiable need for male attention was to blame. Looking back on this period of her life, Margaret reflected, "I was young and pretty, and the men were all incredibly good-looking." In 1943, she suffered a life-altering accident when she fell down an elevator shaft, plummeting 40 feet, landing on her knees, and cracking her head against the wall. The injuries were severe, leaving one side of her body paralyzed, and doctors doubted she would ever walk again. But Margaret's determination saw her through. Within 3 weeks, she left the hospital on her own, though she lost her sense of taste and smell for the next 4 years. Charlie believed that this traumatic event fundamentally changed her. Armchair psychologists have speculated that it may have contributed to what some described as her nymphomaniac tendencies. Despite her struggles, Margaret continued to build a life for herself. In 1945, she was awarded an American Red Cross Theater ribbon. Margaret had entered society as a debutante in the shadow of the First World War, and now, in the aftermath of the Second, she was free to revive her social life. The divorce left her reputation largely intact, as post-war social attitudes had shifted. Margaret and Charlie maintained a semblance of family life for the sake of their children. He visited often, attending pantomimes, decorating the Christmas tree, and celebrating birthdays and holidays. Shortly after her divorce, Margaret began a relationship with Ted Rousseau, a notorious womanizer and curator of paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Ted also had ties to the OSS, working to recover art stolen by the Nazis. Margaret was captivated by his charm and good looks, and their relationship took her on adventures across Europe as they searched for Goering's stolen treasures in Rome, Milan, and Florence. For Margaret, it was thrilling, a secret mission of sorts, but Margaret, with her own wealth and independence, had little need to rely on a man. Upon returning to London, her relationship with Ted Rousseau naturally cooled. Yet love continued to be a central pursuit in her life, and soon she found herself captivated by Joe Thomas, a Texan millionaire and senior partner at Lehman Brothers. He proposed, and she accepted. But before the wedding was announced, it was revealed he had another mistress and intended to marry her instead. Free from the constraints of her past relationships, she embraced her role as a socialite, hosting lavish dinners that included politicians, producers, stars, and those with newfound wealth. Margaret was particular about the company she kept. She insisted on surrounding herself with beautiful women, providing visual appeal for her male guests. If beauty was lacking, then intelligence was the next requirement. She had no patience for what she termed dead wood at her gatherings. Foreign guests were especially favored, as she believed they brought glamour and excitement to her soirees. Her gatherings were not without their quirks. At one such event, her butler, an alcoholic, passed out under the table. Without missing a beat, Margaret apologized to her guests, saying, "I am terribly sorry, but the butler is under the table. He was very drunk, and I had nowhere else to put him." Despite her efforts to entertain, her guests often found her lacking in wit and humor. Female attendees described her as austere and cold, while male guests found her enigmatic and intriguing. It was during this time that Margaret encountered the man who would change her life forever. She met Ian Campbell for the first time on a train. Ian, though penniless, was the heir to his second cousin Niall, the 11th Duke of Argyll, who had chosen to remain unmarried and childless. Ian's reputation preceded him. He was seen as idle, opportunistic, and a seasoned fortune hunter. His first two wives were heiresses. The first was the only daughter of Lord Beaverbrook, and the second was related to U.S. President James Madison. Both marriages ended in scandal, with allegations of cruelty and financial ruin. Despite his tarnished past, Ian's charm and flattery captivated Margaret. He played on her vanity, recounting how he had once seen her in a cafe with his wife Janet and had remarked, "That is the woman I am going to marry one day." Rather than finding the comment insensitive, Margaret was flattered. Soon she invited Ian into her home and her bed, and when he succeeded to the Dukedom of Argyll, she was thrilled. In Paris, their paths crossed again, and Ian confided in her about his unhappy marriage with Louise, the mother of his two sons. He portrayed Louise as the villain, and Margaret, falling for his narrative, began to despise her. Had Margaret spoken to Ian's first wife, Janet, who was often in her company, she might have learned the truth. Ian had a history of violent behavior, beating Janet, stealing her jewelry, taking her to brothels, and subjecting her to demeaning experiences. His vices extended beyond gambling, with a penchant for drugs and alcohol. His debts to French casinos exceeded £200,000, and his inherited debts, including the castle's arrears, totaled £2.5 million. To fund his lifestyle, Ian resorted to manipulative tactics, often threatening suicide to extract money from others. His hereditary titles provided him with collateral, making it easier for him to find wealthy women willing to support him. "I was so alone and felt drawn to this man who had so much charm," Margaret later reflected. In the beginning, all was perfect. They attended glamorous events like Barbara Hutton's ball and partied all across Europe, painting the picture of a perfect couple. Ian even took her to the Globe Theatre to see Invitation to the Castle, and afterward, he proposed. Margaret accepted, unaware that Ian's public courtship was a calculated move to give his estranged wife grounds for divorce, with Margaret named in the petition. She failed to see that she was being exploited, caught up in the excitement of becoming a duchess. Ian's charm extended to her parents, Helen and George, who both took a liking to him. George was especially proud that his daughter would become a duchess, and he offered Ian £25,000 to help with the restoration of Inverary Castle, asking for nothing in return. When Margaret first laid eyes on the castle, she was struck by the beauty of the Argyll countryside and declared it love at first sight. The castle's exterior masked a crumbling interior, overgrown gardens, a roof damaged by fire, leaking rainwater, and rooms filled with dust and dry rot. The once grand estate had become a decaying relic of a bygone era. Margaret threw herself into the restoration of the castle, using her own money. "For the first time in my life, I felt I was doing an important and useful job," she later said. Their public appearances as a couple in London's social circles finally prompted Louise, Ian's estranged wife, to agree to a divorce, citing his adultery with Margaret. Louise was granted custody of their sons, and in a gesture of goodwill, Margaret paid the boys annual school fees of £1,000. Yet the man Margaret had known for the past year, who had never uttered a cross word and who had been kind to her children, changed abruptly after his divorce from Louise. The day after the papers were signed, Ian unleashed his fury on Margaret, calling her children spoiled brats and criticizing her parenting. He then turned his venom on Margaret herself, insulting her friends, her father, and storming off to drink at White's Club. Margaret began to have second thoughts about the marriage, but felt trapped. She didn't want to disappoint her father, who had invested so much in the castle. As the wedding approached, George continued to pour money into the castle's restoration, and Margaret contributed much of her own fortune as well. In return, Ian promised them ownership of many of the castle's valuable items, but it turned out to be an empty gesture. The castle and its contents were controlled by trustees, and Ian had no authority to transfer ownership. The day before her wedding, Margaret received a letter from Charlie, her ex-husband, pleading with her not to marry Ian. Charlie had spoken to Louise, who warned him about Ian's behavior and his neglect of their sons, including his failure to even send them a Christmas card. Margaret dismissed the warnings, believing Charlie was still in love with her. On March 22, 1951, Margaret and Ian married. Just as Ian's previous wives had experienced, Margaret soon found herself fending off his creditors. Despite her efforts to save the castle and support the local economy, her plans faltered. She proposed opening the castle to the public, but the trustees opposed the idea. She also attempted to boost local business by importing tweeds from Parisian designers, but the project failed due to a lack of local knowledge about export processes. Undeterred, Margaret turned her attention to the town itself. Troubled by the lack of entertainment options, she proposed converting an old hall into a cinema. Margaret's marriage to Ian was quickly proving to be a harsh reality check. The glamorous title of Duchess came with more burdens than she had anticipated, and the charming man she had married was revealing his true nature. Despite her best efforts to maintain her dignity and purpose, she was now tied to a man who seemed determined to drain her of both her resources and her spirit. In September, the Argyll Cinema opened to great success, often selling out screenings and becoming a much-needed source of entertainment for the local community. Margaret's efforts extended beyond the cinema. She paid for repairs to the town clock and refurbished townhouses and became popular in the local community. Ian's behavior grew progressively more erratic and cruel. What began as verbal altercations soon escalated into physical violence. Margaret, ever seeking explanations, attributed his behavior to his astrological sign, Gemini, rationalizing that he was two people in one body. Her father urged her to get Ian off the bottle, believing it to be the only way to save the marriage. Despite her efforts, Ian's humiliations continued, both in private and in public. Her stammer worsened under the strain, leaving her unable to defend herself. "He toyed with me like a cat with a mouse," she later recalled. Deciding she needed a brief break, she decided to go to America. The night before her departure, she entertained David Rose, who witnessed a particularly heated argument between her and Ian before taking her out to dinner. While they were out, a burglar broke into her room and stole over £6,000 worth of jewelry. Many suspected that Ian himself had orchestrated the theft. When the police and media arrived, Ian attempted to greet them, but ended up falling down the stairs drunk. In America, Margaret found solace and enjoyment. She even attended Mardi Gras with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, momentarily forgetting the turmoil back home. Meanwhile, Ian appeared to be just as content, engaging in multiple affairs. However, it was Ian who made the first legal move, accusing Margaret of adultery. He believed she was having an affair with a young man she had installed in her Upper Grosvenor Street home. When confronted, Margaret weakly defended herself, stammering, "Surely I'm allowed to have friends." In reality, Margaret was having affairs as well, including one with the brother of Werner von Braun, a former Nazi. Their marriage had deteriorated to the point where they led separate lives, Margaret rarely visiting Scotland and Ian seldom in London. Yet, they continued to holiday together, maintaining a superficial semblance of their marriage. In February 1955, Margaret received a cable from her father, informing her that her mother, Helen, was seriously ill. Helen had spent the last 15 years of her life confined to a wheelchair, battling chronic pain caused by rheumatoid arthritis. Her condition had worsened in recent months, and soon after Margaret returned, her mother passed away. Reflecting on their relationship, Margaret wrote in her memoir, "Although my mother and I did not always agree with each other, I was proud of her, as she was of me." Days after her mother's death, Margaret's daughter, Frances, was presented at court for her coming out. "As I walked into the ballroom, it was brought home to me that the splendor of the 1930s had vanished forever," Margaret observed. The new generation of debutantes was more independent and cultured, with many working as models or secretaries. Frances, following in her mother's footsteps, was named Debutante of the Year. Despite the decline of her marriage, Margaret continued to find joy in her social life. She attended parties, toured the Greek islands with other socialites and celebrities aboard Stavros Niarchos' yacht, and even rekindled a connection with Ali Khan. In October 1956, Margaret's father, George, remarried Jane Corby. The marriage upset Margaret, who viewed Jane as an opportunist preying on a lonely man. George, almost apologetically, confessed to Margaret, "I have been so lonely since Mommy died, and there is not a trace of romance in the whole thing. I simply need someone to care for me in my old age." Margaret, overwhelmed by the situation, burst into tears and cried, "How could you do this to me, Daddy?" By 1956, Ian's health took a turn for the worse when he contracted influenza. The illness left him depressed, and he began taking Drinamol, a powerful drug that combined opioids and amphetamines. The drug had a severe impact on his behavior. He became manic, talking incessantly day and night, and lost a significant amount of weight. After 2 months of this erratic behavior, Ian told Margaret he was leaving her. When she returned home, he was gone, marking the end of their tumultuous marriage. Margaret's world took a darker turn when she learned from her former secretary, Yvonne Macpherson, that Ian would not be returning to her. Yvonne, who had once served Margaret faithfully, had now become Ian's confidant and personal spy. Her loyalty to Ian stemmed from their shared history. Yvonne's husband had been imprisoned with Ian during the war, forging a bond of loyalty that Margaret could never have anticipated. Margaret began to suspect that Ian and Yvonne were conspiring against her, and her suspicions deepened when she feared they might be having an affair. When Margaret finally discovered Ian's location, she called him, ready to confront him with her accusations. Ian denied everything, but then called her back 10 minutes later, asking her to repeat her accusations. Margaret hesitated and heard a suspicious click on the line. Someone else was listening in. She refused to repeat her claims, and her intuition was correct. Listening in on the conversation was Ian's doctor, whom Margaret had spoken to earlier that day, pleading with him to wean Ian off the drugs she believed were altering his behavior. Unbeknownst to her, Ian and Dr. Petrov were plotting to have her declared insane. Their plan hinged on getting Margaret's own doctor to sign off on the papers. Fortunately, her doctor refused and warned Margaret of the plot, but even then, she struggled to believe Ian could be so cruel. Margaret's suspicions of Yvonne grew when stories appeared in the press that only she could have leaked. When she questioned Ian about Yvonne Macpherson's involvement, Ian had Yvonne sue Margaret for slander. At a dinner party, Ian dramatically demanded that Margaret apologize to Yvonne. When Margaret refused and walked away, Ian exploded in anger, calling her a coward. Despite the increasingly clear signs that Ian was planning to destroy her, Margaret continued to trust him, though behind the scenes, she began her own efforts to protect herself and gather information. Amid the turmoil of her marriage, there was one bright spot in Margaret's life. Her daughter Frances had fallen in love with Charles Manners, the 10th Duke of Rutland and nephew of Diana Cooper. Their engagement led to a May 1958 wedding, and Margaret wrote in her diary with a sense of triumph, "I had become a duchess and mistress of a historic castle, and my daughter is now also a duchess." Life was apparently roses all the way, but Margaret's personal life remained far from rosy. On a trip to Toronto and New York with Ian, his moodiness once again cast a shadow over their time together. While Margaret often blamed Ian's behavior for the breakdown of their marriage, she conveniently overlooked her own indiscretions, which had become more frequent. During the trip, she began a brief affair with a young man traveling with his parents. To Margaret's surprise, Ian seemed indifferent to her blatant adultery, showing neither disappointment nor anger. When they reached New York, Ian left early, claiming he had a meeting in London, while Margaret stayed behind with her young lover. When Ian later remarked that she was making a fool of herself, Margaret dismissed him with cutting words. "You are just a stupid, jealous old man." As Margaret's marriage to Ian crumbled, her life became a complex web of betrayals, accusations, and defiance. Despite the title and the appearances, the reality of her life with Ian was one of deep disappointment, as both sought solace in their own destructive ways. Margaret's extramarital affairs became more blatant as her marriage to Ian deteriorated, and she no longer bothered to conceal them. The breaking point came in Sydney, Australia, where they had traveled together to raise funds for the Campbell estate. In public, they maintained the facade of a devoted couple, but behind closed doors, their relationship was in shambles. It was there, in their lodgings, that Ian found the red leather engagement diary on Margaret's dressing table. Flipping through its pages, he discovered the names of half a dozen men she had been seeing. While the entries might have seemed innocuous to an outsider, the peculiar format of the diary and the suggestive nature of the notes led Ian to believe otherwise. He accused her of adultery, and for the first time, she did not deny it. The following day, Ian flew back to the UK, while Margaret, seemingly unfazed, continued her journey to New York to stay with friends. Despite the looming scandal, she remained oblivious to the seriousness of her situation, perhaps relying on her father's influence or simply underestimating Ian's resolve. During her absence, Ian took matters into his own hands. Determined to find more damning evidence, he searched through Margaret's private belongings, uncovering letters and diaries hidden behind a bookcase. Among the documents was a manila envelope containing 2 sets of notes and several Polaroid photographs that would ultimately seal Margaret's fate. In the photographs, Margaret was shown naked with another man whose identity remained concealed, as he was photographed from the neck down. Although Margaret's face was not visible, her signature hairstyle and pearl necklace left no doubt about her identity. These explicit images, particularly one showing Margaret performing a sex act, gave Ian the ammunition he needed to destroy her reputation. However, it wasn't just the photographs that enraged him. Among the papers, he found hotel writing paper with words cut out from letters written by his ex-wife, Louise, arranged to suggest she was questioning the paternity of their children. This discovery revealed a deeper plot on Margaret's part. Margaret, in her desperation to secure an heir for Ian and justify the immense financial contributions she and her father had made to the Campbell estate, had concocted a plan to fake a pregnancy. Her scheme involved adopting a newborn baby boy and passing him off as Ian's legitimate son and heir. The forged letters from Louise were part of her attempt to discredit Ian's existing sons and their claims to the dukedom. Margaret had even approached a friend, asking them to travel to Venice to buy a baby and bring it back to England. Margaret herself had been dropping hints to friends that she was indeed pregnant and was ready to pass the child off as her own. Her friend, recognizing the absurdity of the plan, refused to participate. Unaware of the extent of Ian's discoveries, Margaret continued her scheme, believing she could still manipulate the situation to her advantage. while Ian bided his time, waiting for Margaret to entangle herself further in her lies. She began sending anonymous letters to herself and her daughter, Frances. The letters claimed that Ian's children with Louise were not legitimate. The letters, filled with accusations of lies and slander, were clearly an attempt to further discredit Louise and bolster Margaret's position. Ian, now fully aware of Margaret's deceit, enlisted the help of Scotland Yard to expose her as the author of the letters. He also informed Louise of Margaret's libelous claims, setting the stage for a legal battle that would soon engulf both women. Despite the mounting evidence against her, Margaret remained delusional about her chances of winning Ian back. She believed that her money, social standing, and title would protect her from any consequences. "He knew I adored him, knew I was an idiot," she later reflected. As the court dates for the libel cases loomed, Margaret's once glamorous life unraveled. The public scandal that ensued would forever tarnish her reputation, and the woman who had once gloried in her social status now faced the harsh reality of her decisions. Ian offered her a Faustian bargain. If she admitted to slandering his sons, he would halt the divorce proceedings. Desperate to believe in some remnant of their past, Margaret agreed and went to her solicitors, who strongly advised against it. Yet, through all the lies and manipulation, Margaret still clung to the belief that Ian could be trusted. The hearing was brief, and Margaret signed the injunction, paying £10,000 as part of the settlement. But Ian, true to form, betrayed her once more. Although the hearing was private, he now possessed the injunction she had signed and used it as a weapon to tarnish her reputation. He even showed it to a journalist from the Daily Express, who refused to publish it and instead warned Margaret of Ian's malicious intent. A week later, Ian and his daughter Jean took their treachery a step further. They entered Margaret's house, and Jean physically restrained Margaret while Ian rifled through her belongings, stealing her most recent diary from her bedside table. The law permitted Ian to enter her home, leaving Margaret powerless to stop him. Ian then informed Louise that Margaret had violated the injunction by discussing the children's paternity with others, a claim for which no evidence existed. In this case, at least Margaret was vindicated. The final blow came when Margaret received an interdict banning her from entering Inverary Castle, the very home she had invested so much of her money and effort into restoring. Feeling entitled to her marital home, Margaret ignored the ban and visited the castle with her father and stepmother, Jane. During the visit, she noticed Ian and Jane disappearing on long walks together, leading her to suspect they were having an affair. When they left, Jane made a pointed remark to Ian's driver, saying, "Remember, Peach, you take your orders from the Duke now, not the Duchess." When the interdict was enforced, Margaret was given a single day to collect her personal belongings from the castle. She also hoped to identify the heirlooms that Ian had promised her and her father in exchange for their financial contributions. Accompanied by her lawyers, she walked through the castle, identifying items she believed were hers. Only later did Margaret learn that the promises Ian had made were worthless. He had mortgaged the castle's contents back in 1949 to secure an annual income of £1,000. The realization that her marriage and everything she had believed in had been built on lies was devastating. "My husband was terribly persuasive, as all crooks are," she later reflected. All the money she had invested was gone, and she had nothing to show for it. Her father, George, was facing his own marital troubles. Convinced that her stepmother, Jane, was having an affair with Ian, Margaret hired private detectives to follow her and even attempted to entrap her by sending fake letters from Ian, inviting her to meet him at a hotel. Jane refused, and when she discovered Margaret's schemes, she confronted George. The confrontation turned physical, and Jane emerged with a black eye, claiming George had struck her for speaking ill of his daughter. Jane went to the press, and Margaret and George denied the allegations. The scandal led to their separation, with George paying Jane £20,000. As if matters couldn't worsen, George was diagnosed with throat cancer, and in November, he passed away. Margaret and Jane clashed over the inheritance. A 15-year legal battle over George's property ensued, ultimately won by Jane. In the midst of this turmoil, the case against Yvonne Macpherson finally reached the courts on May 2, 1960. Ian, ever the opportunist, testified against Margaret, and to her dismay, several of her friends also turned against her. Margaret, perhaps sensing the futility of the situation, declined to take the witness stand. The jury found in Yvonne's favor, and Margaret was ordered to pay £10,000 in damages. The turmoil in Margaret's life deepened as she faced yet another legal battle, this time with Jane, her stepmother, who sued her for libel after Margaret accused her of having an affair with Ian. True to form, Margaret did not attend the hearing, and the judge ruled in Jane's favor, ordering Margaret to pay £25,000 in damages. Ironically, Margaret's accusations turned out to be correct, as Jane later admitted to the affair with Ian. While her divorce proceedings dragged on, Margaret sought a new chapter in her life, turning her attention to William Lyons, a director at Pan Am. The two embarked on an affair, traveling the world together. However, Lyons had no intention of divorcing his wife, leaving Margaret once again in a precarious position. During their travels, Margaret remained a target for the press, eager for any scandalous details from her ongoing divorce. After 3.5 years of delays, the highly anticipated divorce hearing finally began. Presided over by Lord Wheatley, a member of Clan Campbell, known for his harsh judgments in cases involving sexual misconduct, the trial quickly became a public spectacle. Margaret took the stand for 13 hours, fueled by anger and determination. Remarkably, she did not stammer once as she defended her right to keep a private diary, arguing that it should not be used against her. The diaries, written in code, became central to the case. Ian contended that Margaret had 3 lovers, using the letter V in her diary to indicate when she had sex. Lord Wheatley agreed with Ian's interpretation, pointing to a letter from one of her alleged lovers, John Cohen, which hinted at intimate encounters. An entry in Margaret's diary on January 13th read Jackie 9-10, with a V marked in the margins. Wheatley took this as evidence of a sexual meeting, deeming it scandalous that they had met in the morning, which he saw as further proof of Margaret's alleged nymphomania. Cohen admitted to having an affair with Margaret, but she maintained that their relationship was purely platonic. Margaret also acknowledged a past affair with the brother of Werner von Braun, which had ended before she married Ian. However, Ian presented letters and telegrams dating up to 1956, though none explicitly confirmed an ongoing relationship during that time. The third accusation of adultery involved Peter Kuhn, a man 12 years Margaret's junior who worked at the Savoy Hotel. Margaret claimed that her relationship with Kuhn was platonic. Private detectives, however, provided damning evidence. On the evening of July 13, 1960, they observed Kuhn arriving at Margaret's house on Grosvenor Street and leaving in the early hours of the morning. Margaret's explanation, that they had stayed up late cleaning up after her dogs and then had a nightcap, did little to convince Lord Wheatley. He found it implausible that Margaret would have cleaned up the mess herself rather than leaving it to her servants. Further suspicions arose from accusations that Margaret and Kuhn had spent Christmas together in Spain, a claim they initially denied but later admitted. Ultimately, Lord Wheatley ruled that Margaret and Kuhn had indeed engaged in an affair, finding her guilty of adultery. The final nail in the coffin was the infamous Polaroid photographs, 13 in total, showing Margaret in compromising positions with 2 different men. Margaret initially denied being the woman in the photos, but upon closer inspection, it was confirmed to be her. She then shifted her story, claiming the man in the photos was Ian and that he had taken the pictures. Ian then submitted to tests, and it was found his measurements did not match the man in the photos. Her defense crumbled. Lord Wheatley's final judgment was harsh, labeling Margaret as having a sex perversion and finding her guilty of adultery. The once glamorous Duchess was now publicly disgraced, her reputation in tatters. The trial had exposed the intimate details of her life, and the verdict marked the end of her marriage to Ian, leaving her to face the fallout of a life that had spiraled out of control. Ian believed the man in the pictures was von Braun, while others speculated it might be Douglas Fairbanks Jr. or even the Minister of Defense, Douglas Sands, who was Winston Churchill's son-in-law. However, it was definitely not Sands, as he had scars on his legs from a wartime injury. Although the scandal forced Sands to admit he had been involved with Margaret, he was not the man in the photographs. Fairbanks, on the other hand, vehemently denied being the man and threatened legal action against anyone who suggested otherwise. Despite his denials, many who had been close to him believed it was him, especially since few people at the time had access to Polaroid cameras. Margaret, for her part, never disclosed the identity of the headless man in the photos. In recent years, there's been speculation that the man could have been Bill Lyons. Margaret, in her memoir, consistently protested her innocence regarding many of Ian's accusations. However, she did admit, Bill was ironically the one man my husband could have named in the divorce, but never did. What Ian also didn't know was that Margaret and Joe Thomas had taken explicit Polaroid photos of each other between 1948 and 1949, long before her marriage to Ian. Joe Thomas's son found the images when going through his father's things and described the images as full frontal, taken in Upper Grosvenor Street. Ultimately, Ian was granted a divorce based on Margaret's affair with Peter Coon. Lord Wheatley, presiding over the case, harshly declared that Margaret was a highly sexed woman who indulged in sexual activities to gratify a basic sexual appetite. Margaret had bitter words for Lord Wheatley, referring to him as an old bastard. Despite her disgrace, some women in the public gallery wrote to her, expressing sympathy, noting that Ian had also been guilty of adultery. Ian wasted no time moving on, marrying a woman 20 years his junior, just 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Margaret, on the other hand, was ordered to pay £50,000, a sum that added financial strain to her already tumultuous situation. The outcome of the trial and the revelations about Margaret's private life shocked the general public. The scandal deepened when Ian sold the rights to his and Margaret's letters, allowing his memoirs to be published in newspapers. In these accounts, he painted a damning picture of Margaret, portraying her as a fame-hungry, nymphomaniac, and abusive narcissist. Margaret, once a fixture of high society, was now vilified in the public eye, and the scandal would forever define her legacy. After the bitter and public divorce, Margaret declared, "I want people to think, here comes a brand new woman." Yet, the remnants of her past continued to cast long shadows over her life, particularly her relationship with her daughter, Frances. By the mid-1960s, their relationship had become strained, a consequence of the lies Margaret had told and her attempts to delegitimize Ian's children. Frances, eager to protect her own children from the scandal surrounding her mother, distanced herself from Margaret. The tension between them became palpable when they crossed paths at a cocktail party. Margaret approached Frances, tapping her on the shoulder and saying, "Hello, I'm your mother." Frances's curt reply, "I know," followed by her turning away, encapsulated their fractured bond. In contrast, Margaret's relationship with her son, Brian, remained strong. He stood by her side as her staunchest defender, offering the support she desperately needed. Margaret spent much of her life after the divorce traveling, often alone, as men hesitated to be seen with her for fear of being tainted by scandal. During this period, she had a brief affair with the son of John Paul Getty, further underscoring her continued allure despite her tarnished reputation. On a visit to Houston, Margaret was treated like royalty, receiving the key to the city and being told by the mayor that her impact was bigger than the Beatles. She even had the opportunity to meet American astronauts, enjoying a level of reverence abroad that had all but evaporated in Britain. In America and other countries, Margaret's reputation remained intact, and she was warmly welcomed by prime ministers, leaders, governors, socialites, and celebrities. However, her relationship with Bill Lyons eventually ended, with Margaret criticizing him for being indecisive and lacking moral courage, as he refused to leave his wife. Their relationship ended abruptly with a simple note from Lyons thanking her for their time together, and they never saw each other again. Shifting her focus, Margaret dedicated herself to good deeds, particularly working with animal sanctuaries. She became a patron and president of an animal sanctuary in Lancashire, using her resources to save animals from euthanasia and paying off the sanctuary's debts. Her compassion for old and abandoned animals gave her a new sense of purpose. That same year, Margaret played a crucial role in saving the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, a historic Scottish regiment, from being disbanded by the Labour government. Despite Ian's previous service with the regiment, he, now living in Paris, showed no interest in the fight. Margaret, however, took up the cause with fervor. She wrote letters, engaged with government officials, and organized grassroots campaigns involving veterans, families, and the public. When she arrived at Scotch House to gather signatures, crowds turned out in droves to see her. And the Queen Mother's personal piper played "The Campbells Are Coming," the song tied to Clan Campbell, and a show of great respect for Margaret. Her efforts bore fruit. Boxes of signatures were presented to the House of Commons, and the Prime Minister was ultimately defeated, ensuring the regiment's survival. Years later, Margaret and Ian crossed paths by chance at the Ritz Hotel. Their brief eye contact was loaded with the weight of their shared history. Neither spoke, and they quietly turned away, leaving the past behind them in silence. In 1973, Ian suffered a stroke and passed away shortly after. "I don't believe he ever loved anyone the way he loved me," Margaret said upon his death. In her introspective moments, Margaret pondered, "Why exactly did we fail, Ian and I? What poisoned our life together?" She added, "Unfortunately, I am only too aware that I am still the same gullible, impulsive, over-optimistic dumb bunny, and I have given up hopes of any improvement." As the 1970s progressed, Margaret's financial situation grew increasingly dire. In an attempt to bolster her finances, Margaret received a £22,000 advance to write her memoirs, titled "Forget Not," a translation of the Argyll family motto. The book, penned by 3 ghostwriters, was a commercial and critical failure. One critic harshly remarked, "Her father may have given her some fine earrings, but nothing to put between them." By this time, Margaret had become a figure of ridicule, often referred to as "that tart Margaret Argyll," evoking comparisons to Norma Desmond, the faded star of Sunset Boulevard, clinging to past glories. With her financial woes mounting and the lease on her house expiring, Margaret attempted to open her home to the public 3 times a week, charging £7.50 per guest. Visitors would receive a tour led by the butler, culminating in a glass of champagne with Margaret herself. However, the public's interest was not as strong as she had hoped, and the venture quickly failed. "I don't think anyone has real style or class anymore. Everyone has gotten old and fat," she lamented as her financial struggles continued. Eventually, she was forced to leave her home on Upper Grosvenor Street and moved into a 2-bedroom penthouse apartment at the Grosvenor House Hotel. The hotel offered her a reduced rate, believing that her presence would add a touch of celebrity and glamour. Margaret continued to seek ways to maintain her lifestyle, hosting cocktail parties in her suite for a £16 fee, where guests could enjoy a glass of Buck's Fizz and purchase a signed copy of her autobiography. She insisted that the hotel staff and guests address her as "Your Grace" and treat her with the deference she believed she deserved. The staff, however, found her rude and entitled, unable to adjust to a world where social hierarchies no longer held the same weight. Behind the public persona, those who knew Margaret privately saw a different side of her. Despite her often grandiose behavior, they found her to be a sweet, kind woman with a sharp, dry sense of humor. One friend remarked, "Margaret was not an especially intelligent woman, but I could not help liking her, and she did say the funniest things." As Margaret aged, she encountered further difficulties, particularly with her household staff. One maid, after being dismissed for passing out drunk at a party, publicly insulted her, calling her a prostitute and other slurs that YouTube won't allow. Another maid ran up thousands of pounds in telephone bills charged to Margaret. Although the maid claimed Margaret had given her permission and accused her of being a forgetful drunk, Margaret, who was neither drinking nor forgetful, won the case. After a decade of living at the Grosvenor House Hotel, Margaret could no longer afford the rent and was forced to move to a smaller residence. She earned a modest income by writing a gossip column for Tatler, but her finances were in shambles. Her mind began to fade, and she struggled to manage her affairs. Barclays Bank sued her for being £26,000 overdrawn. At this low point, a silver lining emerged. Margaret reconciled with her daughter, Frances. Along with her son, Brian, Frances helped pay Margaret's bills and arranged for her to move into St. George's nursing home. Although the conditions were modest, a small room with bars on the window and a shared bathroom, Margaret could no longer care for herself. Even in these diminished circumstances, she clung to the standards of her youth. Each day, she dressed in couture clothes, applied her makeup, and had her hair styled in her signature way. She found contentment in her own world, often sitting in the hall, watching people come and go. When offered a self-contained flat in another wing, she declined, preferring to stay where she could continue observing life around her. As her reality blurred, Margaret sometimes retreated into memories of her glamorous past. When a friend called to arrange a visit, Margaret responded, "I can't see you now. I'm on the Queen Elizabeth, and we are still 3 days from Southampton." It seemed that in her mind, she had returned to the days when the world was at her feet and the pain of recent years had faded away. Margaret passed away on the 25th of July, 1993. True to form, she maintained her standards until the very end. When lunch was served at 12 noon each day, she refused to eat, declaring, "Oh no, I can't possibly eat at 12. Only servants eat at this time." She would wait until 1 p.m. to dine, even if the food had gone cold. In the end, Margaret Campbell, a woman who had lived through scandal, wealth, and ruin, could at least take satisfaction that she could still, at least in this, have her own way. I hope you enjoyed this week's video on Margaret, Duchess of Argyll. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And a special thanks to all our patrons who continue to support us in this endeavor. If you want to become a patron, click on the link in the description. There, you can be part of choosing which videos we post, an extra video a month, and join me on weekly podcasts on some of the stories we don't cover here. Anyway, thanks to everyone who got this far. I love you all, and thanks for watching and being a part of this community. Until next time, stay safe.